This is Vibrant Spaces, a show about placemaking, activating, and connecting city spaces for the communities you serve. Welcome back to another episode of Vibrant Spaces. I am your co-host, Emily Craven, and over here on my right is Timothy Souza.
Hello, I'm Tim Souza.
The one and only. Thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of our downtown van experience with the beautiful ClaIre Leaonard. We are staying in Vancouver this week. If last episode was a snapshot into how events are shaped in downtown, this one asks, what now? So what happens when you try to build permanent vibrancy into place that is used to temporary excitement? Let's put it that way.
You know, like a pop-up, like something that happens on a Saturday.
Yeah, you can't do jazz fingers all the time. Jazz fingers are temporary excitement.
Temporary excitement. And then how do I keep jazzing my fingers, I think is the consistent question that we were asking last week. But I'm excited about getting to speak to our ClaIre number 2 this weekend. I really am. Yeah. She's also from Ireland, fun fact. So ClaIre number 2 coming in also from Ireland. She's from a little place called Belfast, which we'll chat a little bit more about later, but she brings something very unique to this role because she
100%.
worked in placemaking in Belfast, really a city shaped by the complexity and division of violence and reconciliation. And this experience just really gives her something very unique to bring to a North American city, right? And specifically to Vancouver, and building a safer space amongst its own, the tensions of a large city and of overseeing 90 city blocks as a part of this downtown van business improvement association. So her experience is really taking and leading public space and strategy for this city, bringing everything that she's done abroad to her dreams of living in Vancouver and in Canada, to change the world wherever she sets foot. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that here, what I really loved about this episode is it became very clear that, even though they look after such a large area, like 90 city blocks is massive, but those 90 city blocks, there aren't really any plazas, right? Like it lacks plazas or parks or obvious gathering spaces, which again makes the consistent event things difficult. And so they are carving that space out, in terms of laneways. And so I understand the placemaking approach of activating laneways is not new. I am from Australia. Melbourne has done it across many, many decades. But I think that here it's being used to create the space before you can activate it. Vancouver's in that very interesting place where it needs to create the spaces to then be able to do the activations, to then be able to build out those tentacles of networks that make downtown an invitation to bring people around, not just for events, but in multiple different stages of the year.
Yeah, for grandma's birthday on Thursday. We need a space for that. And in a city like Vancouver, where homes are often small, those third spaces become very, very important, right? In those downtown spaces. I think that one of the ways that this episode is really interesting, and I would ask the audience to pay attention to, is how downtown Van and ClaIre speak about keeping consistency and like freshness as far as like what they build without breaking the bank. Yeah, right. I was gonna try to find another way to say that, but like the idea of like, how do you do new things? How do you do new things that draw upon the culture of the city, which is wanting those novelty, within the bounds of sustainability and within the bounds of like giving people something they can expect. So like the reason people love to go to events is because they know that what kind of energy to bring to the event, how, depending on if it's an afternoon event or a morning event, how they are going to show up in that space. And so that consistency is just as important as that novelty. And I think that I would encourage everybody to listen very specifically to how Vancouver is achieving that as well in this episode.
Mm-hmm. And the different ways you can make something feel new without it necessarily being new. Because as much as we love newness, we also love, as humans, consistency.
Yep.
Right? And I think it's a long game approach, right? It's connecting those blocks. It's the beginning of a long journey. Claire is thinking beyond individual sites towards how do you connect those larger swaths of downtown to thread joy and safety across an entire 90 block footprint. And I'm really optimistic about what Downtown Van's doing. So without further ado, welcome ClaIre Leaonard.
Hello, everyone. And we are so excited to have Claire with us today. Claire, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule running the largest IA in Western North America, Canada.
I'm happy for both of those, right?
You know what? I'll give it to you.
Yeah, I'll take it.
Yeah, largest Western VIA. It's so cool. I think you're a super cool person too, and so I think that you get to run this cool thing and be cool is awesome. And I'd love to help the audience get to know you a little bit more. So I think one of the things that you shared with us was that you have moved from Northern Ireland to Vancouver, and specifically downtown Vancouver. And so I'm sure that's a wild experience. And can you tell us the differences between Northern Ireland and Vancouver? But also caveat that your other Claire that's on the same episode is from Southern Ireland, and those are two different places as well. So
truly,
Ireland, rather. Yeah. So I want to just turn it over to you. Tell us about the Irish world, Vancouver world, and that transition and what your life has been like.
Of course. First and foremost, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Em, for inviting me on. I know you've had a previous discussion with other Claire. You can't write this stuff, I swear to God. We have this sort of mythology buried in our DNA where we have two Irish Claires that are working for one downtown Van BAA. But no, fantastic question, and I think it's a really good jumping off point. Northern Ireland is often described as a post-conflict society. There's two very strongly rooted political ethno-national identities that are protected by government. And I think what one community has, so too must the other. So if West Belfast has a community centre, East Belfast will naturally have a community centre of the exact same, if not slightly more value. But what's interesting to me is that Northern Ireland has already had a long history of different diaspora. Indian and Chinese communities have been in Northern Ireland since the 20s and 30s. And that really interested me. And I went back and did a master's at Ulster University. And my focus at the time was on cultural assimilation in a post-conflict society. And I think I was exploring what it meant to be the less serviced other amidst the space that's just really dominated by two very strong ethno-national identities. And that was always really just part of my upbringing growing up. It was quite a divided society. And even though we describe it as post-conflict, as we know, there's never really a truly post-conflict society in any culture. There's always, the victory being written by the winner, supposedly. What was really fascinating is having moved the 4,389 miles exactly between Belfast to Vancouver. I did have to Google it. I've been saying 5,000 miles for a while, but that is a little bit of an upgrade. But in contrast, since arriving in Vancouver, it's been very interesting just identifying how diverse Vancouver is, and there is significantly more suburban community identity, I think, to celebrate one's own culture, as in contrast to what I grew up in, and potentially not feeling that forced sense of assimilation. In my research, I identified that, for instance, the Filipino community in Northern Ireland predominantly would identify as Catholic, so they would sometimes be embraced and assimilated into perhaps more nationalist celebrations of culture, whereas what's really interesting about Vancouver is there seems to be space for everybody to separately celebrate their own identity. Like I was going through the events calendar for not even downtown Van, but abroad. That we've got, Italian Day on the drive. We've got Greek Day, Celtic Fest, obviously. I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out the Irish Diaspora, African Descent Festival. So many different cultural events have space to independently celebrate themselves. And I will also add, it has been a very humbling experience being educated and doing my own research into the Indigenous peoples of Vancouver as well, that sprang from this land before European colonization. So there has been a conscious effort from government to bring people towards truth and reconciliation, and downtown Van build that into our process as well too. So again, very, very different cities, very far apart, and only 3 years in from my experience. So I still have a lot of learning to do and a lot of research to do, but just that was one of the most striking things that I felt almost immediately upon moving to BC from the north of Ireland.
Wow, it's such a wonderful lens to come in from for placemaking, right? Because placemaking is ultimately about the people who make up that place and the cultures that are there. And so to have that kind of very interesting area of placemaking in areas that have had conflict before, like that, it must give you an amazing tool set that we don't normally come across as part of the conversations that we have here. And I suppose this makes me really curious as to what is the biggest change that you've seen since you've moved to Vancouver and now that you are, as you say, Claire 2.0 on the placemaking team. Like, what's the biggest change that you've seen in those few years that you've been here?
This was a really great question, and I did have to ponder it because there has been it's my own perception of change as well too, right? Because I'm sure there's been things that I have not been aware of, given the fact that, I've been living in Vancouver since January of 2022, and my perception of the city has almost entirely been shaped post-COVID, right? So I actually visited here with a really dear friend in 2019, which partially and mostly inspired my thought of, okay, there's something more to be explored here. I want to come back. But then a little old thing called COVID, we might have heard of it, has affected, the timeline of that. And I was quarantined for the first 1 or 2 weeks that I did arrive in BC. And I think after my quarantine period ended, I was so full of adrenaline and expectation that I was really exploring the city with the eyes of a tourist who hadn't quite realized that I'd made that 5,000-mile journey to completely relocate my life. And so I think that gave maybe a bit of a skewed perception of, this is the most perfect city on earth. It is the absolute, canvas that I'm going to have for my placemaking, which is, looking at the factors of sociability, uses and activities, access and linkages, comfort and image, like all that stuff was really front and center in my mind. But what was really interesting is when I actually got into the, brass tacks of community, like how do we even answer that question when I actually began to be employed in the placemaking world? How do we define what community is within a boundary as large as downtown Van? And I know we'll speak a little bit more about the actual space that I carry out placemaking work in, but we're built from very, very different industries and areas, whether that's the financial district that our offices are based in here, the mom and pop shops that lead towards our neighbouring Gastown BAA, or even the nighttime business economy of the Granville Entertainment District. There isn't really one homogenous community that can be defined, and that is a challenge, but also really thrilling and exciting in the same breath. And I think that's been my biggest shift in perception, how very diverse Vancouver is, and not even just downtown Vancouver, but the our BAA Metro Vancouver. It is really a sum of so many different parts, and there isn't really one way to program or create placemaking for just one community. That's a big sort of perception shift for me, having come from a space where we had to make sure there was 50% X programming, 50% Y programming, and maybe pepper a little bit of diaspora in there as well too. But it's been a really educational experience, and it doesn't stop, right? Every day is a school day, as they say.
I love that. And it sounds like what you've really done is not an Irish analogy whatsoever. Pizza. The idea of like
the famous Irish pizza. Yeah,
the famous Irish pizza. You've been used to cutting that in half, and now you've got to put all these toppings on it and find different ways to slice it. That's
it's a fantastic. It's my fault for mentioning Italian Day in the Drive because I think I planted that.
You did plant that. I was trying to come up with a good potato analogy or something. I just didn't know it. So,
boiled versus chips. Yep.
There you go. Your chips are now way more spicy.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Truly.
And so with that, though, adding those flavors, I would really love to talk about how you do it and what you've been doing, because I know,
for sure,
like in some of our other conversations, you mentioned that your that like placemaking in as you were just kind of saying in Ireland didn't go underneath that term even, and so now coming and building the placemaking structures, putting the systems in place, and downtown Vancouver it's like, I know it's like 90 city blocks. I'd love for you to kind of tell us about the details of like what's the scale and scope of downtown Vancouver that makes it so unique. You started to talk about the peppering and the different cultural pieces. Can you give us some stats on from Belfast to Vancouver? Like, I'm sure that those numbers are slightly different. Can you give us some Vancouver numbers so that everybody can understand the kind of community that you're working with on
For sure. Yeah. And I think before we even dive into that, I think you raise a really interesting point about sort of the way I also look at placemaking is some of my most exceptional colleagues are very right brain and left brain. And I think to be a successful placemaker in a modern metropolis, you have to lean into the analytics and the stats and all that information as much as you want to lean into the joy of a certain programming series that benefits the community, say. And the biggest challenge, but also opportunity of a business improvement association as large as we are, is the sheer scale and the scope, right? So when I actually, I worked for in the States and also I think further afield, business improvement associations can be referred to as BIDs, right? So I grew up in a BID, and I was working for Cathedral Quarter BID at the time, and I think it encompassed maybe, I don't want to misquote, but it was significantly smaller than the 90 block radius that we have here in downtown Van. So every BIA will be of different scale and scope, and even our neighbours in West End and Gastown. We often, we're very, very aware that we are extremely well resourced in terms of finances and in staff, in contrast to many, many other business improvement associations across Canada. So those stats, 90 block, the 90 block radius for those who visited Vancouver, kind of stretching from where the cruise ships arrive around the seawall, Cole Harbour, right down to the Granville Bridge. And we serve about 8,000 plus members. Not every single member is actively engaged, but they're still part of our membership, meaning they would receive all our email blasts and they would be included in any of our invites to attend, say, networking things. And I think what's interesting is about sort of setting the context here is we're so well resourced as a business improvement association that we've got 4 different departments. Those are placemaking, my department. I manage a team of 4. And I'm hyper aware that often many entire BIAs don't even have 4 staff. So again, that is a challenge, but an opportunity at the same time. We also have an economic development department. We have a community safety department. And then we have, of course, Marcoms, because there's so much noise and chatter out there that if we didn't have a really strong marketing department, it'd be very difficult to differentiate what we do from, say, even paid activities. So within that, we have a lot of, I guess, freedom. We are funded by business levies, and with that we have a lot of budget, right? So like I think in contrast to maybe some other nonprofit organizations, we have a lot of money to do a lot of stuff.
Can I interrupt? And I know that,
of course, yeah.
You know, listeners are probably curious. You say a lot of money. What can you tell us about the amounts of money like that you guys do like generate? Because it's 90 blocks, a lot of businesses. Yeah. You're saying you're well resourced, you have more staff than other people. So like, is there any like, ballpark, like, hey, we use this amount of, even if you can't give us the money, can you tell us what you, like the number of programs you fund with it so we can get
for sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think that's a good way of phrasing it. It's interesting actually, because kind of I wear more than two hats, because we know as placemakers we do an awful lot rather than just outdoor programming, right? But there is a sponsorship committee that I sit on. So independent of placemaking, there is a sponsorship committee, and we have a fund of 300,000 Canadian dollars, which would support in the region of, say, 50 independent events. So that is separate, sort of siloed from the work that I do within the placemaking department. But that would kind of give you an indication that we are well resourced enough that we have that amount that we can set aside as an independent budget to fund events and festivals in their entirety, as long as they're free, open to the public, inclusive, and happen in the downtown Van business improvement area. We have a very open policy where we can fund those independent festivals. Separate to that is a placemaking budget. Essentially, whatever money we get in from those businesses throughout the fiscal, the organization is able to carve out accordingly to need. So within those four departments, the community safety budget would be, and we can get into that in a little bit, the community safety budget would be the best funded, because of the cost of, trying to keep our streets clean and safe, and offering, like the safety ambassador and the clean team programs that I can expand on a little bit as well. Placemaking is actually a close second, given the fact that our remit is so large, and we probably run about 185 events with that budget. I will say, talking of scale and scope, for every pop-up, one of my favorites, actually, we had a dog therapy Thursday event a couple of weeks ago. So that would be in the region of maybe 10K to run. So for every one of those, we have something as huge in scale as Granville Block Party, which is my largest event in my event calendar. And that's in the region of about 300,000 Canadian dollars to run for a two-day event. It's August 23rd and 24th. If any of your listeners are going to be in Vancouver this summer, little shout out there for my biggest baby, my not even terrible twos. I think my biggest baby is 6 years old now, so that's not even a toddler. So yes, Granville Block Party is the big focus for me. So that can kind of give you an indication as to the actual scale. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I know that, because sometimes people are like, great, that's what is a lot, especially in these days when numbers get thrown out as if most of them are made up, to know that, like, hey, here are some tangible pieces. So thank you so much. Anything else you'd like to share about that downtown Vancouver dynamic that we're about to have this conversation in? Because I want to make sure we kind of jump back on track there.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think what's also really important to mention is that we do publish a report called The State of Downtown. Shout out to my colleague, Sean Bailey, who puts a lot of energy and effort from the economic development team. And that is it's completely easy to access. You just go on our website, and I'm sure we can link people into that in the future. But that's a really, really sleek, sophisticated, well-designed, but critically interesting factual report on the metrics and stats of what it is to be part of downtown. And I think just some super quick stats, there's about 130,000 people that are working in the downtown core. About 140,000 are residents. The median age is about 38. And I think the median income is around 81,000 Canadian dollars. So there's obviously like a relatively young population with some disposable income, but we are also the most densely populated city in Canada. And the stat that I pulled this morning, which kind of beggars belief, but we had 106 million visits to downtown in 2024. So I think, yes, there's a core residential population, but there's also an absolutely astronomically huge visitor population that comes in through cruise ships and through air travel as well too. So that's always an interesting point. Like, how do you build community when there's a transient young community that move for work, as well as a transient visitor community that come for maybe a long weekend or up to 10 days and then go on. So again, more fun, creative challenges for me and my team to explore.
I love that. So with that, and being one of the most densely populated environments, I know that in some of our prior conversations, you're kind of limited with green space or flat space or programmable space, both for yourselves and then for the community to program in. Can you tell us how you're addressing, that challenge? And then we can get into some other challenges, but that one kind of specifically, that is it's almost like a benefit and a negative at the same time, where like, yes, you have so many people who live downtown versus cities like Dallas that are struggling with like 15,000 people downtown versus you're like 10x that or 100x that, right? So like with the amount of people coming into your city consistently. And so what are you doing for the space that the people got to play in that's not like their house or their business?
That's true. And I think, you know, I'm sure many of your colleagues or anyone who's listening who works in placemaking, who is in quite a built up environment will relate to this struggle. But one of my bigger pet peeves is the lack of green space or the lack of flat space. Given the fact that we are as huge in scope as we are, we only have 2 parks within that area. And again, it's highly competitive whenever, even as a business improvement association, we don't get first dibs, you know, and that's good. It's good because you want obviously democratizing of space, and you want as many people to be able to apply through our city to have a permit to do their own event or to parks and do their own event via the Parks Board. The big challenge that we actually identified years ago, way before my time even moving to Vancouver, and definitely before my time of knowing what placemaking was as a theoretical concept, is how do we create space out of nothing? And we do have the benefit, I guess, as I mentioned, like plazas. There's a couple more plazas that there are parks, but not everyone always wants to throw an event in a plaza. There's something about like the textural, soft setting of also being able to do things in a park. And I think they're maybe a little bit more family friendly and forgiving on infrastructure as well too. So we've actually, as of, I believe it was as early as 2016, the placemaking department, which has existed for a very long time, but is not, you know, as evolved as it has become to be, had identified that there are a lot of laneways in downtown Vancouver, as is the case, I'm sure, with a lot of different metropolitan spaces. But we had identified that the way that we could potentially begin to explore this is through gradual laneway transformation. I think we'd identified through our partner HCMA, an architecture firm, there was 240 laneways within the greater expanse of the downtown core. And that's a lot of real estate that was being not, maybe, I hate saying underutilized, because those laneways are always designed originally for the purpose of deliveries and for municipal services. But that might be only a couple of hours out of an entire 24-hour window. So we developed what we have called the Awesome Alleys strategy. We published it this year, which is a 5-year strategy to 2029 that we really redevelop and transform some of those spaces. So we're on our 4th transformation this year. The first in 2016 was called Alley Oop. If you Google it, it's also colloquially called the Pink Alley. And I'm really proud that often when you do a search engine optimization type thing with Google or Bing or whatever service you provide, Alley Oop will pop up as one of the first hits of like placemaking in Vancouver. So it's really costly to maintain and run those spaces. But the idea is you're basically creating cleaner, safer, brighter, lighter space where not only us as a BIA can program and activate, but we would encourage anyone to do that. All that really requires is a little bit of like forward planning and a permit. So we're basically just trying to create a network of interconnected spaces where people can do their own events. We had an event there 2 weeks ago in partnership with a great crowd called Binners Society. So I would encourage anybody listening to look up our Vancouver's Awesome Alley strategy. It's quite a comprehensive document. It's a considerable piece of work. I'm working on a transformation right now, but I find it the project management of that, to me, is just so fascinating, because it will benefit not only us as a BIA, but the community downtown indefinitely moving forward.
Are you saying that I could like throw a birthday party for my grandma and bring
you absolutely could, as long as you make sure that you got your traffic management in place, because we don't want grandma getting run over, Tim. So yeah, we would just make sure. Yeah, again, it would be as simple as, pursuing a permit with the city, and then you can shut that down. So that's the hope. We've had 4. We want to commit to 9. There's been 4 that have been transformed: Alley Oop, Snookham Lane, Ackeries, and actually the plan is behind me on the wall. I did not plan this, but there it is over my shoulder. Dilly Dally Alley is what we're calling our most current transformation. So I'm really in the thick of that at the moment, working with painting contractors, working with all our infrastructure. I had to do a leachability report last week, which is lead paint testing. So I actually love how involved I am in the process of that. It's to me, it's the real, like, roll your sleeves up and get down to the work that I always wanted to do when I was involved in placemaking. But increasingly, depending on how high you up are the food chain, there's maybe less chance for you to do that. So wherever there's an opportunity to just physically do something, I'm the first to put my hand up and want to do
it. It makes sense to me that you would go with a laneway strategy for this, right? Because I understand that laneway strategies are not new. I know that a lot of people here have probably implemented their own laneway strategies and all of those sorts of things. But it makes a ton of sense, particularly when we look at the fact that in Canada, it's a very car-heavy and car-centric country, just from weather alone and public transport and dealing with that weather. And so what are your safer places that you can convert into public spaces if the plazas have not been built? I know that there are policies and legislations now that make sure that, like, things like plazas are incorporated within development and all of that sort of more public realm related stuff, but you have to deal with the legacy buildings that are in your city when the city is X number of, decades old. And so a laneway strategy makes sense because it is the areas of the city that you cannot remove the car reliance, but you can find safer spaces. Those alleyways see less traffic, therefore they can be more easily shut down than a street. And so the more public realms and public spaces in different areas of the downtown blocks that you have, the more choice you have for doing your programming, for getting people out, all of those sorts of things. And so I'm really interested in how you are now planning to layer your placemaking goals across these kind of disciplines. So you're obviously building the laneways as you're going, you're in the thick of things, getting paint done, all of those sorts of things. How are you now layering the different placemaking that you're doing over these spaces that you are creating to augment the small parks or plazas that you currently
Right. I think this is another great question. My view of placemaking has been tailored, obviously, specifically to the eccentricities, I'll say, of Vancouver. And similarly, like you mentioned, Dallas, they're, depending on the city, like, it's another really valid point that this is a very young city. Vancouver is about 100 years old. I grew up in Ireland, I'm used to a totally different ancient country that has had, eons of development over seemingly millennia. I know that's the case. Again, there's obviously always been Coast Salish people in British Columbia, but the idea that we've only really had this sort of like springing up of like mega development over the last 100 years has meant that there hasn't been as many, say, medieval spaces for gathering or what have you. It's always been developed to be a residential modern city. I think the great question that you asked there, and alluding to the beginning of my sentence, because I do have a scattergun approach sometimes to answering these questions as I form my thoughts. I look at placemaking as 4 pillars. We've got our activations, which is, your boots on the ground programming, your beautification, which is increasingly a larger part of our budget, where we look at the wayfinding, we look at greenery and planters and just making spaces look cleaner and brighter. We look at the strategic planning, which would be, I've got, in addition to my awesome alley strategy, I'm also really proud to have published a public art strategy recently, where we're looking at how do we envision public art being really critical to that secret ingredient that maybe Vancouver sometimes is lacking, in the fact that it's a beautiful city, but the wayfinding and the public art will continue to be improved as time goes on. But critically, also,
that's very unique to you guys as well.
It is, yeah, very much so. And maybe, like people have, and I wouldn't be one of those people, but I can understand the criticism of occasionally certain people referring to Vancouver as being, you know, a beautiful woman or man with no personality. And the idea that it is a beautiful vista, but because we are a young city, you know, we maybe haven't invested in much as in the spaces that maybe people can congregate and build community together. So the maintenance, the fourth pillar, I should say, being the maintenance pillar of that foundation of placemaking, and that is increasingly expensive as well too. But I think what's really fascinating is because it is there's a lot of space. Yes, there's small plazas. Yes, there's smaller parks. Now we've got the laneways. There's also our relationship with our property developers. Development is a reality of living in Vancouver, not even just downtown, but into the suburbs and into the area where I live in South Granville. We have the benefit of really strong relationships with little to no bureaucracy with some of these property managers and property developers, where they will have their own private, like their private plazas and their private parks, where we've had fantastic events, and we don't have to jump through the same level of, you know, red tape in order to host those events. So I think I look at it almost like a heat map of, and a kind of an index as to what we're doing where in scale and scope. So it could be something which is pop up in Lot 19, like I mentioned, that dog day, or we've got a fantastic series coming up, a music series where we have music every night, every day, I should say, in Lot 19 over the lunch hour. But increasingly, like, you know, then something huge in scope where I shut down Granville Street to run Granville Block Party as well too. So there's a lot of different scale and scope to do an awful lot. But I also think in certain things as well, scope creep can threaten to happen. And that's what I don't want, because we actually cannot put an event on in every single 90 block in the entire BIA area. We do have to really think very carefully about what we are doing, what's legacy, what's a pop-up. And as I mentioned, that maintenance piece with, say, damage, things going walkies, things like that, you know, we have to consider the fact that there has to be an increasing amount of maintenance that is the reality of placemaking in a space like Vancouver, which has its own, you know, socioeconomic challenges as well too. So it's a really good question, and I don't want to take up the entire interview talking about it. I could probably answer that in an entire hour podcast, but we do our best to kind of look at scale and scope, and also not forgetting that we have to factor in a big contingency for the maintenance of events and beautifications, as well as, you know, those strategic plans as well.
Yeah, you have a lot to hold in your head, my friend. Those Truly. Are a lot of different spaces, a lot of different ways to think about not only just programming, activating, allowing for actual commerce to happen, so you can continue to fund that budget that allows you to do the things. I can see where taking a full look at, okay, great, what is both public and private? How do we activate on these pieces? How do we invite the public into this space, make it feel vibrant for those who live there and who are visiting, but also recognizing limitations and challenges that the city of Vancouver has, namely, we've talked about that the open space to be able to do that kind of activities. But there, you know, Vancouver has a couple other challenges, and I think that your team is doing such a great job in addressing them that I'd love to just name them quickly and talk about like what you guys, how you're incorporating that, because you are a new city, you don't have like the space for, like you just said, you're not as old as Belfast. So like there's definitely a difference of like even the communal spaces and things that the city has to address, or the BIA has to address, that the community hasn't had the resiliency built within itself over a few thousand years to address itself. And so with that, I just kind of would love to start here and be like, how is your team addressing that safety, inclusivity, especially after the most recent tragedy that happened in downtown Vancouver? And I want to just open that kind of up to you to answer.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. And I think, you know, as you say, like, to name it, we were all absolutely devastated with the tragedy that happened on the 28th of April. It just so happened to coincide with the Lapu Lapu festival. I hate associating Lapu Lapu with that tragedy, but I don't name it like that. I name it the 28th of April because I think any event manager will know that they really don't deserve for a festival to be associated with something as deeply distressing as that. And I think that is also a really stark reminder that placemaking is a discipline. It is a field that is in its infancy in terms of like the research and the lack of information maybe, or the growing body of information of research as to how critical it is, not only for social cohesion, but now we're on the other side of it. We're experiencing whenever you guide people to use and celebrate in a public space, your duty of care also extends to that community as well too. And I think I have always been a risk assessor. I come from an events management background. I also think the reality of being Northern Irish is that I've always, anyone, you know, from a post-conflict society or maybe specifically Northern Ireland, has that their amygdala often firing, like we're hyper alert to threats and challenges, and that's just maybe unfortunately or fortunately part of our DNA. So whenever this occurred, the immediate thought is obviously like compassion for the community that was impacted, because it is truly every event manager's worst nightmare. From my perspective, fortunately, because of the resources that we have as a business improvement association, Granville Block Party has always been as watertight as you can imagine. We have, because it is a full road closure, we do put a lot of infrastructure in place in order to mitigate any attempts of any kind of like attacks or ramming. There are other events in our portfolio that this has really given us pause to kind of sit down as a group and really come together. And I think for a lot of us to realize that it's more than just, you know, a fun pop-up event. It is where we're creating this space where safety is top of mind, and it's always top of mind for me. I will sacrifice programming costs in order to put more security and more preventative measures in. But the philosophical question has also been raised about not wanting to build a fortress. And if you think about like the definition of placemaking being like encouraging people to come together in a space, and like I mentioned before, like the idea of the comfort and image of that space within placemaking, that's going to be really, really critical, I think, to all people working in public space moving forward, and not just specific to Vancouver, right? Like there's been unfortunately incidences across the world where these sort of terrible tragedies have happened. So I feel like we have to have our wits about us, but we also can't let fear win. And I know I say this from the really privileged standpoint of somebody that has the resources to put towards protecting people in those environments, but BIAs in downtown and sorry, I should say BIAs in Vancouver and in Canada have come together and will come together to kind of discuss how we have a new approach and a new template moving forward, because the nature of space was changing anyway, I think, due to economic factors, and this just so happens to be like a really ugly, horrible way that it reared its head. We owe it to our community and the public to create as safe a space as possible in environments where often the safe space is not guaranteed. So
I love that you guys are approaching it from like a balancing accessibility, openness, and security. Like you're really looking at that trifecta and saying great in this space. And I think it kind of goes beyond tragic events, right? In that space. It also is just the everyday things that the downtown Vancouver is facing, from, you know, homelessness to addiction to mental health challenges in the population. Are all of those also being kind of addressed in that same within that same triangle? Or do you have like other things that you are like programming?
I'm thinking maybe we have some sort of like other shape for that as well too, right? Because it's even more than a trifecta. I'm like, I don't know, an octagon or whatever. But the idea is that and again, it was a real eye-opener for me when I first moved to Vancouver as well too, because every city will have their own kind of like particular ratio or formula of how those socioeconomic issues are visible. And we are extremely fortunate in downtown Van, BIA, that we have a very well staffed and resourced community safety department, where the organization has placed a lot of energy and effort into a safety ambassador team that patrols the entire 90 blocks, redirecting to resources. Like, we de-escalate where we can. The clean team, which looks after the sanitation and cleanliness of that space as well. But the reality is, we're in unprecedented times, and I think this is something that's affected not only Vancouver but across the world, and particularly thinking of West Coast North America, because of the favorable climates as well too. And again, this is completely out of my wheelhouse, but it's also helped us as placemakers really just practically think about what are we doing, who are we doing it for, and rather than lament and like wring our hands about, oh, we can't have nice things. And I don't agree with that. I feel like it actually just strengthens our resolve to just be creative and do placemaking a little differently. So to give you an example, I am a big fan of greenery. I want as much greenery as possible, but often, a stunning planter on Granville Street, it may not look the same in 2 weeks after I put it in, say, in the middle of the summer. That is just the reality of, doing things in a public space. So our way of mitigating that is hanging baskets. So we just have the same gorgeous greenery, but higher up, so it's kind of the human interaction of it will be less. And that also goes for our mural art. We do like anti-graffiti coatings on all of our murals, and we look at it through the lens of assume that if it's going to be interacted with, as we say, it will be, and just putting the mitigation efforts in, which is made for some like really fun exploration with light as well. Like, lighting again can increase the perception of safety. I know we wanted to talk about canopy at some other point.
I know, let Em jump in and ask. She has
okay, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
you guys are doing some fun stuff with lighting, and it's great to know that it's coming out of as well this understanding of safety and place and interactability, as you've labeled it. I love that so much. And you wanted to chat about the lighting solutions in Vancouver. I think I'll just toss it to you, Claire.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear all of those considerations that go into that as well, because that's obviously necessary as part of, as we've said, your safety, your inclusivity, all of those components that we want to really do effective placemaking. But at the same time, those kind of considerations are what actually make great placemaking, right? Because you can't just go in there and events be your only thing, right? Or making a parklet be your only thing, right? Those kind of considerations have to go into everything from like, how can we make something temporary and safe, or something that is temporary because of the nature of an area, so that we can have these wonderful things and we can keep track of them, like having things that are much more longer term and like the mitigations that go as part of that. And so what I'm curious about is how do you balance those one-offs? Taylor Swift came to Vancouver this last 12 months, and so you've had activations that were a part of those kind of like one-off events to activations that are much more long-running, like your lights display across Christmas, and all of the things that go into making something feel safer, making something feel permanent plus temporary. It's really that balance of like newness, right? And like many people, I think Vancouver is kind of one of those simple places where newness is a thing that really drives people's want to visit a place. And so how do you balance those long-term versus short-term activations, those permanent versus maybe semi-permanent, and to mix in a way that is sustainable and doesn't mean that you have to spend $100,000 every time you want to do a new thing to meet that need to be new, to meet that need to be, Instagrammable. Newness tend to come with people wanting to share photographs of themselves doing the new thing. What is that way that you build that sustainability in a way that supports you from year to year, beyond just running events? Yeah, and I think that is, again, a question that we all ask ourselves as placemakers, right? Like we want to bring people to
city hubs. We want to bring, and particularly in Vancouver, that sort of obsession with the newness or the new thing is often, the reality of what maybe drives a lot of people to visit somewhere like Lapu, where if you put that into Instagram with a hashtag, you will, someone who'll have taken a photo of it today, say, and that's kind of like a self-perpetuating machine of encouraging people to visit. And I think the question for me always is, who are we really serving? Is it just tourists? Is it just residents? Is it just our members? Is it all of the above? And it is all of the above. So there is kind of like a formula that we've been tweaking over the years, which is from our work plan. We've got those 185 events, right? But that will change. That will slightly fluctuate year on year, depending on what level of newness we want to bring in. Newness being, top of mind next summer for FIFA, I might add. So like for my budget, I'll siphon a little bit away on Silo in anticipation of doing something spectacly and new. But I'm also a big believer in, like, if it ain't broke, there's no need to fix it. Granville Block Party has slightly been tweaked over the years, but it still attracts 40,000 people to the downtown core. Our beloved summer movie nights is every Thursday in the North Plaza by the Art Gallery, and that's been running for a number of years as well too. Everything that we do, I should also caveat, is free to the public as well. There's never any charge to be involved, and it's fully inclusive and accessible. So with accessibility and inclusivity first of mind, the budget's then carved up, X% towards my activations, X% towards my beautifications, increasingly more and more towards my maintenance, but always looking to think, okay, how am I going to be able to utilize this in the future? So I'm glad you mentioned Canopy. Canopy was a big investment for our organization. It is a fully presetted, programmable lighting string that we put up in Robson Square Plaza. It has 22 presets, something like 20,000 bulbs. It's an incredible achievement between our designer Tangible and ourselves. So that was 3 years in the making, and that goes up every November, December, January, February. So that's kind of a way that we invest every fiscal, but I know now that's kind of, hopefully in perpetuity, we will have that up every winter. So too will we put up, and you'll kind of notice the theme here, these are all aerial displays, because again, that human interaction, we can kind of mitigate that. Yeah, so unless you're incredibly tall, you're really not going to be able to interact with, and that's not a challenge, anyone who's listening, you're not going to be able to interact with that display, and therefore it helps with the longevity of it. But we also had another piece which was award winning. I think there's an embargo, we cannot release the exact award name yet, but I think it will be released in September. But we had an award-winning display. It was an art overhead pride poem where the sun at 11 to 12 noon in the summer casts its rays through coloured perspex, and this sort of incandescent, soft, colourful light diffuses down onto the plaza. So it's as immersive as you'd want to get, and those kind of immersive but out of harm's way interactions are where I project and want to be in the future. I want to do amazing award-winning projects where possible, but not at the cost of, it not serving the immediate people who walk through there. Like, that's not my top goal. My top goal is just making curious, interesting space that makes people pause and think, oh, that's not something I've seen before, and just maybe bit of a perception change. But the sustainability question is a real one, because we can't afford to do, those canopy projects every single year. But maybe looking at how do we utilize them in different creative ways. I've already got my eye on how do we repurpose some of our previous installations. You mentioned the Taylor Swift installation. We were really pleased to work with a studio based out of Montreal called Le Monde, and they created these bespoke hand-cranked lipstick, cowboy boots, etc. for the Taylor Swift activation. They were hand cranked 4.4 million times. That is an absolutely phenomenal vanity metric that I would not have been able to predict. So the other part of the equation is the methodology of how we measure that as well too. It's fine and well investing X amount in something that's beautiful that we can kind of measure in a qualitative sense. But realistically, I want to measure this quantitatively so that I can make a case to do these big, large scale, high impact things in the future as well.
I I love that. And I think that part of my favorite part of that lighting project was that like it is that reusable, right? You can change out those LED patterns, you can create a different display, you can create that novelty, but you're being sustainable and you're keeping your assets protected. So we've talked about kind of what you're doing. You've talked a little bit about those. I kind of love to hear that piece that you're most excited about that is going to like allow the listeners when they visit Vancouver to check it out in the next couple of years as they plan that trip.
I love this question, and I love that we're ending on this as well too, because I don't want to sugarcoat like anything that we've discussed. I do. Anyone who's listening, who's working in placemaking in public space, like know that I appreciate this. It's not idealistic, like it's not a utopian space that we work in Vancouver, and I don't want to present it as such. There are real challenges to doing placemaking work here. On the flip side, we also have that benefit of being a spectacularly beautiful city that has attracted now, I think we've got, this is maybe our 5th or 6th major spectacle sporting event that's been attracted to come to Vancouver over the last couple of years. I wasn't here for the Olympics, but the legend and the legacy has lived on way beyond, I think, what anyone sort of anticipated. And my hope is that with FIFA coming around the corner, so too will there be this legacy of investment. We do need more investment in Vancouver and more sort of conscientious developers to understand, and I see this happen very frequently when I visit European conferences about developers that are looking at building in placemaking to their infrastructure, whether that's a ground floor that's like a communal space or whether that's a big plaza or garden as part of their development. And I think that's kind of short of creating more space the way that we're doing with the Awesome Alley strategy. I foresee that being the future of placemaking in Vancouver, just us having more room to do things with conscientious partners, because often it's a very hostile funding climate and fundraising privately is very, very difficult. And I say that as someone that's, coming from a very well-resourced organization. So my sympathy it goes out to anybody who's trying to like fundraise from zero. It's very, very difficult. It's very, very competitive. So my hope is that with all eyes on Vancouver for FIFA, we had, Grey Cup, we had Invictus Games. I think there is a lens of spectacle events visiting Vancouver. And I think so too, hopefully, the investment, my anticipation is the investment should follow, and we will have a different space downtown where we literally have more opportunity, to do large scale things on plazas or smaller impactful things within communities. And I would encourage anybody to research the Granville plan. There is an ambitious longer term plan that will take many, many, many years, but it has just been voted in by council to pedestrianize parts of Granville Street, which would mean we would have even more public space for, us to do outdoor events or, for me to do more public sculpture. I'm really interested in trails. I love when I visit cities to follow a trail. So I'm thinking about how I build in different trails to the downtown core to just encourage people to explore beyond maybe the one thing that their guidebook, how antiquated their guidebook has told them to visit. Let's be real, it's Google reviews or something, but I want us to think beyond that. And I think, we're a really, really fortunate city, not without its problems. And I'm really excited to be thinking ahead to the next 5 years in downtown Van as well.
Well, I visit Vancouver every couple of years, so I can't wait to see this next iteration myself of what you guys are doing. And I just wanted to thank you so very much for joining us today. I wish we had like 4 hours to have this conversation.
Don't threaten me. I would take it as well.
I want a whole series with you, Claire. This has been fun. So I just wanted to thank you so very much for joining us. And we're going to close this out. And I can't wait to see what Vancouver does as we get to watch you move it forward into the future with FIFA and honestly this physical transformation where you're taking a beautiful city and making it active. So thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you so much.
Cheers, everyone.
Man, I really loved that revisiting of downtown Van with Claire. Like, it really clarified a bunch of questions that I had from episode 1, where I was maybe worrying a little bit about the future of Downtown Van if events were all that they were kind of digging their teeth into, but like it's not.
They're so not.
There's a lot. There's a lot. Like, and we love. I think we love it when we speak to guests where it's very clear that their purpose is to make sure that joy is a part of the infrastructure, right? She really reframes joy as something that you can build into the city in the same way that Melissa and Jared, who we loved having on, also looked at building joy into a city. You know, it's an acknowledgement that it's not just something you schedule joy at 3 p.m. on a Sunday. It's an important shift for a lot of cities to make. You must be joyous at this designated time. We've put up flags.
Only between 1 and 3
trucks. Right? And I think that the downtowns that we speak to where placemaking does not just equal programming, right? And placemaking does not just equal infrastructure build and they will come. That like it's not one end of that spectrum or the other end of that spectrum. It is you need all of them. You need the placemaking is the programming, it is the infrastructure, it is the third spaces and the in-between events, tissue. Right? It's that and it really resonated for me that placemaking is a way that you create belonging, and through that you get the prevention of behaviors that you are trying to change, right? The habits that you were trying to change of how people interact with the city. And so I like the whole idea of safety, not as surveillance, but as belonging. How do people feel like they belong rather than it being watched by CCTV cameras, rather than feeling, they feel invited and included, rather than feeling chided. It's like that is public safety. Right?
It is. And I think that too, I get excited because it's all of those connective tissues and those pieces that allow for that smart decision making that kind of really backs up everything that we do on the day-to-day with Story City.
Yeah. And I think that, sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, and so I think that like it's great to see a city who is actively working on the problem that we have identified and that we built an entire business around solving. That it's nice to see cities doing that, and so it's almost like that parallel evolution of like, yes, everything that we're doing is also noticed by these teams who spend day in and day out and who oversee massive downtown cores, right? They understand that this problem is a problem when they're overseeing all of those city blocks and seeing how everybody interacts on a hour by hour basis with the businesses and the residents and the city itself.
Yeah, and as they build out those third spaces and as they build out the interconnected tissue between events, what I would hope that Claire and her team do, because they talked a lot about like intercept surveys and observation of people at events and all of those good data collecting things.
Right.
But that is a kind of like I would call that like a co-creation light. And I would hope that as they build into that yes, they solicit opinions for what people are interested in, what makes them stay and all of those sorts of things. But then they use that co-creation relationship to then have the community propose their ideas for filling in the gaps, which is something that we will get to visit later in this season with the lovely West Palm Beach. You guys are going to love this. But that would be my hope for how this evolves as Claire's team get themselves established, take over the old programming and then start to put their own footprint on what that means for them as their team with a new leader.
Yeah, and I think that, even though you wanted to jump to the East Coast quickly, the thing that Vancouver is doing really, really well is in connecting those interconnective tissues is the fact that the downtown van is a bid, or a BIA, rather. So like, in a way, yes, we want them to co-create with the community in that regard, but they are co-creating with those businesses. And
They
I think
are.
that
That's
the
very true.
fascinating things in this public kind of private partnership that they do have out of the nature of their being as a BIA, right, is that it really does highlight that real innovation often happens outside of City Hall, but
Mhm.
often like adjacent and holding hands with it. It's collaborative. It's not, hey, we're going to do this to spite the city. It's, hey, the city, we're going to do this, and we hope that it aligns with the rest of the city, and we're going to work with those organizations, city organizations, businesses, et cetera, to make that alignment. It kind of feels like secondary research to me, not primary research, which is what you're encouraging.
Mhm.
But it is, they are doing the research. And I do want to highlight that it is, they do a great job with that private public connection that they've built.
That's very true. And I think that they're also doing a good job in starting to use storytelling infrastructure sustainably, right? So like Claire talked about the reprogrammable lighting as one way to keep activations feeling new. They purchase the infrastructure, they change up the lighting patterns and things so it feels new every year, right? And it made me think a little bit about how, like Story City's digital infrastructure does the same thing, right? You offer a new experience without necessarily the need to rebuild it. You can use similar formats, you can use, things like scavenger hunts, but you can change them up to take people to different sides of the city. You can change them up so that they have interviews, or you can change them up so that they have puzzles. Like you can use the same structures, and you can offer a new experience, generally in a much quicker turnaround, and a newness like much more quickly than having to buy new infrastructural equipment, than having to spend, $50,000 on a new mural and like all of those kind of things. Like they do those kind of tentpole related ones, but they're now looking at how do they storytell with the infrastructure that they already have? How does that make things feel new? Like I really love the strategicness of that, right? They're building the space to program it. And so
and I think
you have to
that's
invest in the
exactly what
space
they're
creation
doing.
first. Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's what they're doing with their laneway strategy too, right? Is that they're like, hey, we don't have, it goes back to that initial setup that we kind of had at the beginning of the podcast where it's like, this is the exciting thing. They don't have parks. They don't have plazas. They don't have that programmable place to put the tentpole. So they're addressing that issue as well of how to, like, the famous one being the hoops, the basketball one, right? Where it's like, if you want to go play and do sportsy things, we now have a space for sportsy events, gatherings, community building, right? That pickup game that the city doesn't organize, that the downtown BA is not organizing, but that the people living in those buildings are organizing on Meetup or WhatsApp, and they're just coming down to play basketball because they now have a space to do so that's safe between certain hours, because there's, trash still has to be picked up, street cleaners still got to get in there, deliveries still have to be made, but they've built that. They're starting with the place to put that tent pole.
Yeah, you can't invite people if there's nowhere for them to gather, right? And the way they're using lighting, the way they're using murals, the way they're using wayfinding to start telling those local stories. It reminds me of how like infrastructure can really become that communicative tool as one of those tent poles. And then, their events are kind of on lock. And so like, now let's do those connections in between events, right? They're in a really good place.
Yeah, and I think that, and in being able to, they built the infrastructure for those events, and to touch on it briefly, shit happens, right? In cities when people gather, and I think that the placemaking lens that they're coming at this with, I think, Claire has the benefit of having grown up in a conflict zone of Belfast, but being able to bring that kind of strategic understanding about how the community and the team both feel about the spaces, the conflict, and then building that trust in downtown so that they can hold positive tentpole, Granville Island kind of events, but also hold what happens when humans don't act the way that we want humans to, right? And so being able to strategically build the infrastructure so that safety is paramount, so that belonging and the ability for people to gather in those third spaces isn't just about having that physical space, but making sure that the community knows that it's a physical space that's safe for them to gather in.
And that placemaking does not require you to wait for an area to be conflict free,
No,
to do it.
absolutely not.
Mhm.
Right. Especially when they're taking laneways, right? And a lot of downtown Vancouver's laneways are not exactly places that I would take my younger nephews and nieces to go play in at the moment, but they're cleaning that up. They're fixing it. But I'm going to guarantee you there's going to be like a needle or two that will appear over time in a laneway, and that they've designed the system to make sure that those are removed from those spaces as quickly as possible is, I think, just as impressive to me about the way that the team is thinking around building space and making place for their community.
Yeah, and and part of that belonging is also acknowledging that certain cities have a certain culture.
Sure.
And as we've said before, like Vancouverites expect new. They expect things that they can take photographs of, and they expect things to be new. So they expect pretty and to sometimes to not be uncomfortable, And so making that newness scalable in a way that, we acknowledge that you can't afford constant installs. Like FIFA is coming up within Vancouver. It's going to be in their ability to have scalable components that they can leverage FIFA to build those out further, to use scalable platforms like Story City to refresh narrative without necessarily having to rebuild everything, having to have converted 10 laneways by the time people hit the ground. It's that idea that newness is scalable, and yes, you have your anchors. Granville Block Party, they're moving from that event reliance. They have those tent poles, but it's early days, and that's a big opportunity for them. Is that as they begin this laneway strategy, it means that that connection is an opportunity, but also a challenge.
Yeah, and we brought in FIFA into the conversation. And so, like, when those large events, whether it be FIFA or TED conferences or Taylor Swift coming in, when those when those large draws are generated, I think that it's interesting that they're wanting to play with wayfinding as well, right? Turning that environment into an explorable space. And another city that is doing and another city that is doing that really well is kind of our next week's episode in Austin, of wayfinding, reliance on major events, shifting away from reliance on major events, and building out the explorability of that downtown space. And so I think that what I love in this conversation is we built from, okay, events can't be your tent pole. How can you build around so that you can place more tent poles, right, in your physical infrastructure?
What is stopping you from placing the canvas over the tent poles, right? Like, what is stopping you from
building that interconnective tissue and moving into next week of, okay, let's see it with a city in the States who has built their entire vibrancy space around a couple of large annual events, and they've noticed that has become a weak point, so they're moving away from it. And so we can do a direct comparison between Vancouver and the city of Austin, which we hope to show to you next week.
Which I love that. So heading to Texas, we are going to have a wonderful time with Matthew Schmidt from the Office of Culture, and talk about that, what happens when placemaking becomes policy. It's going to be really exciting. We highly recommend that you come and listen to Matthew talk about placemaking and cultural policy from an economic lens, where for a really long time, the reason that they have been able to build the kind of reputation that they have is because they have been able to protect their arts under economic development and the acknowledgement that arts does bring in a lot of money into a city. And so I'm really excited for you guys to hear that conversation.
Yeah, and they take a definite different approach than the city of Vancouver, who also has a lot of art in that downtown space that funds, that is funded by businesses, that brings people in to make them feel fun, etc. So I'm going to say that again. And in a different way than downtown Vancouver does, who already has a bunch of the art up, just like Austin, and they're learning to draw people in and about. So thank you so very much for joining us today with the city of Vancouver, and we will see you next week in Austin, Texas. Cheers, y'all.
The Vibrant Spaces podcast is produced by Story City. You can find our entire archive on any podcasting app and on about.storycity.app, where we publish transcripts and show notes. This episode was produced by Tim Souza, and our staff includes Justin Kahn, Brett Ludwig, and Victoria Umitska. Our theme song is Happy Indie by Alex Guz. Our co-hosts are Tim Souza and me, Emily Craven. As always, thank you for listening. We hope you have a glorious adventure this week.